She left no farewell. No tears, no final handshake. Vivian Hawthorne passed away one October morning, as quietly as she had lived her final years, while her only son was in Vegas, celebrating a new business deal with her money. But what no one knew, what Ethan Hawthorne would face in that will reading room, was that the woman had prepared a verdict, not in words, in signatures and notarized seals. If you think money always flows to blood relatives, watch this story to the end. Like and comment the name of the city you're watching so I know how far my story has progressed. My mother never raised her voice at me. Not once. Not even the time I crashed her car into the neighbor's fence at 17 and tried to blame it on a stray dog. Not when I dropped out of my first semester at Columbia without telling her for 3 months. Not when I showed up to my father's funeral 40 minutes late because I'd been arguing on the phone with a broker about a deal that fell through anyway. She just looked at me. That was it. That long, quiet look that said everything she refused to say out loud. I used to think that look meant she forgave me, that she understood me in a way other people didn't, that she saw something in me worth protecting. It took her death for me to understand what that look actually meant. My name is Ethan Hawthorne, and for 38 years I was absolutely certain that I was the most important person in my mother's life. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about almost everything. My father, Gerald Hawthorne, built the family business from nothing. That's the version of the story I grew up hearing. Anyway, the bootstraps narrative that got trotted out at every holiday dinner, every board meeting, every time someone needed to justify why the Hawthorne name carried weight in this city. Gerald had started with a single hardware distribution warehouse in 1974, and by the time I was born, he'd turned it into a regional empire. Hawthorne Supply Company, with contracts across 6 states and a client list that included 3 Fortune 500 companies. He died when I was 22. Heart attack, second one. The first one had been a warning shot that he ignored because Gerald Hawthorne didn't believe warnings applied to him. That stubbornness was genetic, apparently. What he left behind was a company worth somewhere north of $40 million, a house in Westchester that had been in the family since 1962, a summer property on the Connecticut shore, and my mother, Vivian Ann Hawthorne, née Calloway, who had spent 31 years being the quiet engine behind everything Gerald built without ever getting credit for a single decision. After he died, I assumed I would step into the role naturally. I was the son, the only child. It was simple math as far as I was concerned. My mother didn't correct that assumption. She just kept doing what she'd always done, managing the house, attending board meetings when necessary, keeping the accountants and lawyers on speed dial, making sure the machinery of the Hawthorne estate kept running while I focused on what I considered more important things. Deals, partnerships, the kind of high-visibility business activity that felt like building something, even when it wasn't. The truth, which I only pieced together after everything fell apart, was that my mother had been running the estate almost entirely on her own for 16 years. And she had been watching me, quietly, carefully, the way you watch something you're not sure you can trust. I need to tell you about Charlotte because you need to understand who she was before you understand what happened. Charlotte Reed was my mother's niece, daughter of my mother's younger sister, Paula, who had married badly twice and died of ovarian cancer when Charlotte was 19. Charlotte had no safety net after that. No inheritance, no family money, no connections. She'd put herself through nursing school while working nights at a diner, graduated without fanfare, and spent the next decade working at a rehabilitation center in White Plains. She and my mother had always been close, but I hadn't paid much attention to that. Charlotte came to holidays sometimes. She was polite, quiet, the kind of person who helps with dishes without being asked and never stays too late. I think I spoke to her directly maybe a dozen times in 15 years. I didn't consider her important. She didn't have anything I needed. I know how that sounds. I'm not trying to make myself look better than I was. The thing is, while I was busy not noticing Charlotte, she had been showing up for my mother in ways I hadn't. When my mother had her hip replaced in 2019, Charlotte took 2 weeks off work and stayed at the house to help with her recovery. When the pandemic hit and my mother refused to leave Westchester, Charlotte drove up every other weekend with groceries and stayed overnight so my mother wouldn't be alone. when my mother started having trouble with her memory. Small things at first, misplaced keys, missed appointments. It was Charlotte who noticed, Charlotte who brought it up with the doctor, Charlotte who sat through the cognitive assessments and took notes because my mother's hands were shaking too hard to write. I lived 40 minutes away. I visited at Christmas and sometimes Easter. I called on Sundays when I remembered. I want to be honest with you about this. I knew my mother was getting older. I knew she needed more support. I just assumed it was being handled. I never asked by whom. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October. I was in Las Vegas for a conference, one of those industry events where you spend 3 days shaking hands and eating expensive food and convincing yourself you're building relationships. My phone rang at 7:14 a.m. and the number was Charlotte's. I almost didn't answer. I had a breakfast meeting at 7:30. Ethan. Her voice was flat in a way that told me immediately something was wrong. It's your mom. She passed away about an hour ago. It was her heart. I remember standing in the hotel room, still in the clothes I'd slept in, and not knowing what to do with my hands. I kept reaching for things, the TV remote, my watch on the nightstand, and putting them back down. Was she alone? I asked, and then I hated myself for asking that instead of something else. No, Charlotte said. I was with her. Of course she was. I flew back that afternoon. The house in Westchester felt different when I walked in. Smaller somehow, like something structural had been removed. Charlotte was there, along with my mother's attorney, a man named Douglas Finch, who had handled the Hawthorne estate for over 20 years, and who greeted me with the specific kind of careful neutrality that lawyers reserve for situations they know are about to become complicated. I'm sorry for your loss, he said, shaking my hand. Your mother was a remarkable woman. When do we do the will reading? I asked. Charlotte, who was standing by the kitchen counter with a mug of tea, looked at me over the rim of it. She didn't say anything. Finch said, I'd like to wait until the rest of the family has had a chance to travel. Your mother had specific wishes about who should be present. What family? I said. There's me and a few cousins. This shouldn't be complicated. Your mother was thorough, Finch said. I think it's best we follow her instructions. I should have heard something in that sentence. I didn't. Mushat. The will reading was scheduled for the following Saturday. In the intervening days, I stayed at the house and did what I told myself was grieving, though, if I'm being honest, a significant portion of my mental energy was already devoted to logistics. The Connecticut property needed to be assessed. The company board would need to be notified about the transition of ownership. I had calls with my own attorney about the estate tax implications. I was already acting like the owner. In my mind, I already was. My cousins arrived Thursday evening, Marcus and Diane, children of my father's brother who had died years earlier. They were cordial, sympathetic, not particularly close to my mother, but present for the occasion. Marcus shook my hand and said, Rough deal, man. She was a good woman. Diane brought a casserole that nobody ate. Charlotte moved through all of it like a ghost. She was always there, making sure there was coffee, directing the caterers, managing the small logistics of a house full of grieving people, but she barely spoke to anyone unless spoken to. I noticed vaguely that she and Finch exchanged a few words in the hallway on Friday evening. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Friday night I couldn't sleep. I walked downstairs around 2 a.m. and found my mother's reading chair empty in the study, the lamp still on, a book left open on the side table. The book was a collection of short essays. There was a small yellow sticky note on one of the pages in my mother's handwriting. It said, Remember what you said about the difference between earning something and expecting it. You were right. I didn't know who she'd been writing to. I closed the book. I turned off the lamp. I went back upstairs. Saturday morning came in gray and cold. We gathered in the formal dining room. Me, Marcus, Diane, Charlotte, 2 of my mother's oldest friends named Ruth and Patricia, and Douglas Finch, who had arranged the chairs in a loose arc facing the end of the table where he stood with a leather portfolio in front of him. I sat in the chair closest to Finch. I wanted to be positioned as the central figure in the room. Even then, I was doing that. Thank you all for being here, Finch said. Vivian was very specific about the structure of this reading. I'm going to ask that we go through the document in full before any questions or discussion. That was her explicit request. He opened the portfolio. He began to read. The first sections were standard: the dissolution of household accounts, charitable bequests to 3 organizations my mother had supported for years, personal property distributions. She left her jewelry to Charlotte. She left her book collection to Ruth. She left a specific painting, a seascape that had hung in the upstairs hallway since I was a child, to Patricia. She left me her father's watch. I told myself that was a placeholder, that the real distributions were coming, that the watch was sentimental, separate from the financial provisions. Finch kept reading. With respect to the primary estate assets, he said, and I sat up slightly, including the Westchester property, the Connecticut Shore property, and the controlling shares of Hawthorne Supply Company, the following structure applies. I leaned forward. Vivian established the Hawthorne Family Trust in March of 2021, into which all primary assets were transferred and legally held. The terms of the trust were finalized and notarized in August of 2023, 14 months before her death. Marcus shifted in his seat. Diane put down her coffee cup. The trust, Finch continued, designates a primary beneficiary and trustee upon Vivian's death. The beneficiary and trustee is... He paused. Not for effect, I think, just because the next word was the one that mattered, and he was careful with it. Charlotte Ann Reed. The room went very quiet, and then it didn't. Hassan. I'm sorry. What? I heard my own voice like it was coming from somewhere across the room, high and strange and not quite controlled. Finch looked at me with that same careful neutrality. Charlotte Reed is designated as primary beneficiary and trustee of the Hawthorne Family Trust. All primary assets, real property, business interests, and liquid holdings contained within the trust, transfer to her upon Vivian's death. That's not possible, I said. She's a niece. She's not a Hawthorne. I'm the son. I'm the direct heir. Ethan. Charlotte's voice was quiet. She was looking at the table, not at me. Don't, I said. I was trying to keep my voice level. I wasn't succeeding. Just don't say anything yet. Finch, is there an error? Is there a version of this document that predates the trust? There is a version of the will that predates the trust, yes. However, when the trust was established, it superseded those provisions. The trust is the controlling document. It was properly executed, properly notarized, and has been reviewed by... She was sick, I said. Her memory. The cognitive. She wasn't competent to be making decisions like this in 2021. She was already... In March of 2021, Finch said, and his voice was measured but firm now. Your mother underwent a formal cognitive assessment at the recommendation of her physician. She was assessed as fully competent to manage her financial and legal affairs. That assessment is attached as an exhibit to the trust document. I sat back. The room was still. Ruth had her hands folded in her lap. Patricia was staring at the table. Marcus and Diane were looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite categorize. Not unsympathetic, but not surprised either, which told me something about what they'd expected, even if I hadn't. Charlotte still wasn't looking at me. There's more, Finch said quietly. Your mother prepared an accompanying letter, which she asked me to read in full. I didn't want to hear the letter. I wanted to stand up and walk out of that room and call my own attorney and start pulling on every legal thread I could find. My hands were flat on the table in front of me, and I was pressing them down hard because it was the only way I could keep them still. But I didn't move. I don't know exactly why. Maybe some part of me understood, even then, that the letter was going to say something I needed to hear, even if I didn't want it. Finch unfolded a separate document, 3 pages, handwritten, which he'd had transcribed for clarity. He put on his reading glasses. Ethan, the letter began, and just the sound of my name in my mother's words, even read by someone else, hit me somewhere below the sternum. If you're hearing this, then I've gone ahead without getting the chance to say this to your face. I've thought about saying it to you in person many times. I always stopped myself. I think I was afraid of what you would do with it. I'm not afraid anymore. Finch's voice was even, professional. The words were anything but. You are my son, and I love you. That has never been in question, not for a single day of your life. But love and inheritance are not the same thing, and I spent too many years allowing you to believe they were. I allowed you to believe that the Hawthorne name was something you were owed rather than something you were meant to carry. I should have corrected that sooner. That failure is mine. I heard Diane exhale slowly. What I watched you become over the last 15 years grieved me more than I was able to show. Not because you are a bad person. You are not a bad person, Ethan. But you stopped growing. You stopped asking. You started treating the people around you as resources rather than as people, including me. I watched you look through Charlotte at family dinners for a decade. I watched you call me on Sundays for 9 minutes. I kept track for a while and spend most of that time talking about your own projects. I watched you stop asking questions about my life, my health, my fears, and I watched myself stop expecting you to ask. My jaw was tight. I was staring at a point on the table in front of me. Charlotte never stopped asking. Charlotte never came to me with her hand out. She came with her presence, her time, her patience, her attention. Things that cannot be bought and cannot be faked over 9-minute phone calls. She sat with me through fear and confusion and pain. She did not do it for what she would receive. I know this because I watched her do it after the trust was already in place. She didn't know. I never told her. And here is the part that I replayed in my head for months afterward. The part I still come back to. I am not punishing you, Ethan. I want you to hear that clearly. This is not punishment. This is consequence. There is a difference, and understanding that difference is the first thing you will need to learn in order to become the man I believe you are still capable of being. You have your father's ambition and his stubbornness and his refusal to show need. These things are not flaws in themselves, but without humility, they become a cage. You have been in that cage for a long time. I hope this opens the door. I am leaving you the watch your grandfather wore when he built the first warehouse. He used to say that a man's worth is in what he does with the hours, not what he inherits at the end of them. I hope you will hold on to that. I love you, my son. I'm sorry I waited so long to say the hard thing. Mom. Finch folded the pages and set them on the table. Nobody spoke for a long time. What happened next is something I'm not proud of. I want to be clear about that. I pushed back my chair. I said loudly enough for everyone in the room to hear that this was a manipulation, that my mother had been confused, had been influenced, had been, and I use this word, and I hate that I used it, captured by someone who had positioned herself for years to take advantage of an old woman's loneliness. Charlotte stood up from the table. Her face was very still. Ethan, she said, your mother was not lonely. She was surrounded by people who loved her. You just weren't one of them most of the time. The room got very quiet again. I didn't do any of this for the money, she said. I didn't know about the trust until Finch called me 6 days ago. And I need you to believe that, not for my sake, but because if you spend the rest of your life convinced that every act of care is secretly a transaction, you're going to end up alone in a way that has nothing to do with money. She picked up her jacket from the back of her chair. I'm going to take a walk, she said. I'd appreciate if everyone takes a few minutes. She left. The door to the hallway closed softly behind her. I stood at the head of the table with my hands balled up at my sides, and Marcus was looking at his shoes, and Diane was looking at me with something that might have been pity, and Ruth and Patricia were holding hands like they were bracing against something. And I thought about my mother's reading chair, the lamp still on, the sticky note in her handwriting on a page I hadn't read. Remember what you said about the difference between earning something and expecting it. You were right. She hadn't been writing to me. She'd been writing to Charlotte. I drove back to the city that night, alone. I didn't speak to anyone before I left except Finch, briefly, in the foyer, where I told him I was going to review my legal options, and he told me calmly that he understood and that he would cooperate fully with any inquiry, and that I should know that the documentation was thorough. Your mother was very thorough, he said again. I wanted to argue with that. I couldn't. The drive home was 2 hours in light traffic. I played nothing on the radio. I just drove and let the highway come at me out of the dark and tried to figure out when exactly I had stopped paying attention. I couldn't find the moment. That was the worst part. There was no single turning point I could point to, no day I could identify where I'd made the choice to become who I'd become. It had happened gradually, the way most damage does. Not a break, but a drift. Small adjustments, repeated over years, until the distance was enormous and I had no memory of traveling it. My mother had known, she had watched it happen, and she had waited. Not for me to fail, I didn't think she'd wanted that, but for something. For the lesson to become necessary. For there to be no other way. I got home around midnight. I sat in my car in the garage for a while before I went inside. In my coat pocket was my grandfather's watch. I'd put it in there after Finch handed it to me at the door, almost without thinking. I hadn't looked at it since. I took it out now. Heavy. Worn band, slightly scratched crystal. The kind of object that had absorbed years of being handled and carried and checked in the middle of long, difficult days. I turned it over. On the back, in small engraved letters, H.H. Do the hours right. Harold Hawthorne, my grandfather, who had started with a single warehouse and a work ethic and had built something real. I sat there in the dark for a long time, holding that watch, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I wasn't thinking about what I was going to get. I was thinking about what I had lost, and whether it was too late to understand why. The first thing I did when I got back to the city was call my attorney. His name was Preston Waite. We'd worked together for 6 years, mostly on business deals, the kind of transactional legal work that never required much emotional weight. I called him at 8 on Sunday morning, which he did not appreciate, and I told him everything, the trust. Charlotte, the letter, the watch. All of it, in the flat, pressurized tone of a man who has not slept and is running entirely on adrenaline and wounded pride. Preston was quiet for a moment when I finished. Then he said, "When was the trust established?" "March 2021, and she had a competency assessment attached." "That's what Finch said." "Ethan." He paused. "That's a serious document. If the assessment is legitimate and the trust was properly executed, a challenge is going to be an uphill fight." "I don't care about uphill," I said. "I want to know if there's a path." "There's always a path. But I need you to understand what you're walking into before you start. Undue influence claims require showing that someone had a controlling relationship over your mother at the time of the document's execution. You'd need to demonstrate that Charlotte was in a position to manipulate her decisions. She was there all the time, constantly. She inserted herself. Being present isn't manipulation, Preston said. Being present is called showing up. Courts distinguish between those things. I didn't say anything. "Send me everything Finch has. I'll review it. But I need you to be realistic about what this process looks like if we go forward." I told him I understood. I didn't, really. At that point, I was still operating from the belief that if I pushed hard enough, the situation would correct itself. That the world as I understood it, the one where the Hawthorne name meant something, where being the son meant something, would reassert itself if I applied enough pressure. That belief was about to take a serious beating. The documents arrived from Finch's office on Tuesday. Preston called me Thursday evening, and his voice had a quality I hadn't heard from him before. Careful. Like he was measuring each word before he released it. "I've been through everything," he said. "Twice." "And?" "Your mother was meticulous, Ethan. I want you to understand what I mean by that. This isn't a will drafted by someone who is confused or influenced or making decisions under pressure. This trust document is 63 pages. The exhibits alone run to another 40. She had it reviewed by 2 independent estate attorneys before she signed it. The competency assessment was conducted by a neuropsychologist at a hospital in White Plains. Not a GP, not someone Finch referred, a board-certified specialist. The assessment is 11 pages, and it's thorough. I sat down on the edge of my desk. Okay. There's more. Finch included something called a supporting documentation annex. Your mother kept records, Ethan. Detailed records. Going back at least 8 years. Records of what? Preston took a breath. Of everything. Financial decisions you made that affected the estate. Loans she gave you that were never repaid. A specific incident in 2018 involving a business venture she funded that lost a significant amount of money and that you never disclosed the full scope of to her. Documented instances of, and this is her language, not mine, financial disregard. She also kept a personal log. Not a diary exactly, more like notes, observations, dated entries about conversations you had or didn't have, visits, phone calls. I was very still. She wrote down how long your Sunday calls lasted, Preston said quietly. She logged them. The thing about hearing that, the thing I wasn't prepared for, was that it wasn't anger I felt. It was shame. Deep, cold shame that moved through my chest like water through a crack in a foundation. My mother had sat alone in that house and written down the length of my phone calls because the calls were so short that she needed documentation to make herself believe they had happened at all. "Preston," I said, "can we win?" He was quiet for a long moment. Challenging the trust is possible in theory, but her documentation directly preempts the most viable arguments. Undue influence. She's got evidence that Charlotte's involvement was responsive to need, not orchestrated. Lack of competency. The assessment covers that. If we go to court, we will be fighting her records with our arguments, and her records are better than our arguments. What are you telling me? I'm telling you to think very carefully about what you want this to cost you, financially, reputationally, and in terms of what it says about how you're choosing to respond to what your mother wrote in that letter. I hung up shortly after that. I sat at my desk for a long time without moving. I had been so certain. That certainty had felt like solid ground for my entire adult life, and now I was standing on it, and it was giving way underfoot, and I didn't know what was below it. I called Marcus that night. Of all the people connected to this situation, he was the one I could talk to most plainly, mostly because he didn't have a stake in it and didn't particularly care about softening things. "I figured you'd call eventually," he said when he picked up. "How bad is it?" "The documentation is airtight, apparently." "Yeah." He didn't sound surprised. Aunt Vivian was always the sharpest person in any room she walked into. She just didn't make a point of advertising it. "Did you know?" I asked. "About the trust. Before Saturday." "No, but I can't say I'm shocked." He paused. "Ethan, I'm going to say something and I need you not to get defensive." "Go ahead." "When's the last time you actually spent time with your mother? Like, not a holiday, not a Sunday call. Actually went up there and sat with her." I thought about it, genuinely tried to pinpoint it. "I was there for her birthday in March." "Which birthday?" Her... I stopped. "Her 73rd. "That was 2 years ago," Marcus said. "Her birthday in March was her 75th. I didn't respond. "I'm not saying this to pile on," he said. "I'm saying it because you asked me how bad it is, and that's how bad it is. The legal situation is one thing, but I think you already know the legal situation isn't really the point." I knew. I just wasn't ready to say it yet. I did something the following week that surprised even me. I drove back to Westchester. Not to the Hawthorne house. Charlotte was staying there, and I wasn't ready for that conversation. Not then. I drove to the rehabilitation center in White Plains where Charlotte worked. I parked across the street and sat there like someone with very poor decision-making skills, watching the entrance, not entirely sure what I intended to do. I didn't go in. But while I was sitting there, I saw her come out on her lunch break. She was in scrubs, her hair pulled back, carrying a paper bag and a coffee. She sat on a bench outside and ate alone, and she looked... I don't know how to explain it exactly. She looked like someone who was carrying something heavy but was accustomed to the weight. Not defeated, just tired in the specific way that people who do hard, necessary work get tired. I drove away without speaking to her. I know that sounds cowardly. It was. But something shifted in me on that drive back. Something small and deeply unwilling. I had been building a case in my head for weeks. Charlotte as schemer. Charlotte as opportunist. Charlotte as the woman who had positioned herself so carefully over years that my mother hadn't been able to see what was happening. I had needed that narrative because without it, the alternative was too much to absorb. The alternative being Charlotte had simply been there, and I had simply not been. The call came on a Friday, 3 weeks after the reading. Charlotte's number on my screen. I almost let it go to voicemail twice before I answered. "I'd like to meet," she said. No preamble. "Not to argue about the estate. I want to show you something." "What?" "Your mother kept a box. Personal things, letters, photographs, a few other items. I think you should have it. I was going to mail it, but it didn't feel right. I agreed to meet her at a coffee place in White Plains the following Saturday morning. I spent the entire week telling myself I was going out of a sense of obligation, not anything else. I was lying to myself, but that was becoming a habit. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with a cardboard box on the seat beside her. She looked different from the last time I'd seen her. Less rigid, maybe? Or maybe I was looking at her differently. We ordered coffee. We didn't say anything important for the first few minutes, which felt strange and necessary at the same time. Then I said, I want to ask you something. Okay. Did you ever ask her for anything in all that time? Did you ever suggest that she should consider you for the estate? Did you ever have that conversation with her? Charlotte looked at me for a moment. No. Never. Never, she said. And I need you to believe that isn't some careful legal answer. It's just the truth. I didn't want her money. I wanted her company. She was the only family I had left after my mother died, and she was good to me, and I liked being around her. That was the whole thing. I looked at my coffee. She never told you about the trust. No, Finch called me the day before the reading to let me know, so I wouldn't be blindsided in front of everyone. I sat in my car in my parking lot for 45 minutes after that call. She paused. I wasn't happy, if that's what you're wondering, not in the way you might expect. I was terrified. I didn't want this responsibility. I didn't want to be the reason you and I were sitting in a room not looking at each other. Why are you telling me this? Because, she said, I think your mother wanted us to find a way to be on the same side eventually, and I don't think that happens if we keep pretending the other one is a villain. I sat with that for a moment. It was harder to argue with than I expected. She reached into the box and pulled out an envelope. This is for you. She wrote it separately from the letter Finch read. She called me about 2 months before she died, which I now understand she must have known was coming, and she told me there was an envelope in her desk with your name on it. She asked me to make sure you got it privately. She slid it across the table, my name in my mother's handwriting. Ethan, open when you're ready, not before. I picked it up. The seal was intact. I put it in my coat pocket. Aren't you going to open it? Charlotte asked. Not yet, I said. She said when I'm ready. Charlotte nodded slowly. She knew you. Yeah, I said. Better than I knew her. There is a version of this story where I went home that day, opened the letter, had some kind of transformative moment, and started immediately rebuilding myself into someone better. That would be a cleaner story, easier to tell. What actually happened was messier. I went home and put the envelope on my nightstand and didn't open it for 11 days. I went back to work. I had meetings. I called Preston twice more about the legal situation, and both times he gave me the same careful, measured advice, and both times I told him I'd think about it, and then didn't. I was in a specific kind of limbo that I suspect anyone who has been genuinely confronted with their own failures will recognize. Not the dramatic breakdown, not the immediate redemption, just the long, unglamorous middle ground where you know something needs to change and you don't yet know how to start. Marcus called me one evening during that period and asked how I was doing, and I said fine, reflexively, and he said, no, you're not. Nobody who's actually fine says it that fast. I don't know what I am, I said. That's more honest. He paused. You know what I keep thinking about? That note your mom left in the book. The one about earning versus expecting. I hadn't told him about that. How do you know about that? Charlotte mentioned it. She found the book when she was packing things up. She didn't know what it meant, but she thought it seemed important. Something moved in my chest. It was something she and Charlotte talked about, apparently. Something Charlotte said to her. About you? I think so. I don't know. I exhaled. I keep running the math on it, Marcus. How many times I could have driven up there. How many calls I could have made that lasted longer than 9 minutes. And I cannot figure out why I didn't. I was busy, obviously, but everyone is busy. That's not an answer. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Can I tell you what I think? Sure. I think you believe she would always be there. I think you had this idea, somewhere underneath everything, that she was permanent, that the house was permanent, and the company was permanent, and the inheritance was permanent. And because it felt permanent, you stopped treating it like something you had to maintain. He paused. That's not a unique failure, Ethan. That's just a very human one. The question is what you do now that you know. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. He was right. I had treated my mother's love like a fixed asset, something that accrued interest on its own, something that didn't require tending because it would always be there when I needed it. I had taken the most constant thing in my life and converted it, in my own head, into something I didn't need to think about. And she had known. She had known, and she had gone on loving me anyway, and she had made her decision not in anger but in clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you've watched something long enough to understand what it really is. I pulled out the envelope from my nightstand that night, my name in her handwriting, open when you're ready. I turned it over in my hands for a while. I wasn't sure I was ready. I wasn't sure what ready even felt like anymore. But I was beginning to understand that the floor I thought I was standing on had never been as solid as I'd believed, and that somewhere beneath the collapse of everything I'd assumed was mine, there might be something real, something I hadn't built yet, something I was going to have to earn. I opened the letter on a Tuesday night in November, 3 weeks after Charlotte had slid it across the coffee shop table. I don't know what finally made me do it. Nothing dramatic happened that day. I hadn't had some breakthrough conversation or some moment of cinematic clarity. I just came home from a meeting that had gone nowhere, made myself dinner that I barely touched, sat on the edge of my bed, and looked at the envelope on the nightstand and thought, enough. Enough waiting to feel ready. Enough pretending that the right emotional state was going to arrive on its own if I gave it enough time. I opened it. My mother's handwriting was smaller than usual, like she'd been trying to fit more onto fewer pages. 3 sheets, front and back. No date at the top, which meant she'd written it sometime in the months before she died without wanting to anchor it to a specific day. Ethan, I've been sitting with this letter for a long time without writing it because I keep trying to find the version that doesn't hurt you. I've decided there isn't one, and that trying to protect you from discomfort is part of what got us here. So I'm going to write the true version instead. You've been angry your whole life. I don't think you know that about yourself. Your father was the same way. Not violent, not cruel, just this low-level anger that ran underneath everything like a current. Gerald turned his into fuel. I watched him build things with it, but I also watched it cost him. I watched it cost us. And then I watched you inherit it without inheriting the discipline that kept it from becoming destructive. The business decisions I'm referring to in the formal documents, I want you to understand that I'm not including those to humiliate you. I included them because they are the record of something I enabled for too long. Every time you came to me with a shortfall, every time a deal went wrong and you needed the gap covered quietly, I covered it. I told myself it was support. What it actually was me removing the consequences that would have forced you to grow up. That's on me as much as it's on you. I accept that. What I cannot accept, and what I need you to understand, is the pattern that developed underneath all of it. Not the money. Money is recoverable. What I mean is the way you stopped seeing me, not maliciously. I don't believe you ever intended to become someone who looks through his mother, but intention is not the same as impact, and the impact, over years, was that I became someone you managed rather than someone you knew. I don't want your guilt about this. Guilt is useless to me now, and it will be useless to you if you let it become a substitute for actual change. What I want, what I am asking for, in the only way I have left, is that you take this period, as hard as it is, and let it do the work it's supposed to do. Not the legal battle, not the anger, the work underneath that. You are capable of more than you've allowed yourself to be. I have always known that. I am betting everything I have on it being true. Mom. I sat with those pages for a long time. The apartment was very quiet. I could hear traffic outside, the distant sound of the city doing what it always does. Indifferent to what was happening inside any particular building at any particular moment. I read it 3 times. Not because I didn't understand it, but because each time I read it, I understood something different. The first time I felt the blow of it, the directness, the refusal to soften what she was saying. The second time, I started to hear something underneath the directness that wasn't anger. It was grief. My mother had been grieving the relationship we didn't have for years before she died, and she had carried that grief quietly because she didn't believe telling me would change anything. The third time, I put the letter down and sat in the dark for a while and let myself feel, fully and without managing it, what it meant to have been loved that completely and wasted it so thoroughly. It wasn't a clean feeling. It wasn't a breakthrough. It was just heavy and raw and real, and I sat with it until it was late enough that I should have been asleep. And then I lay down and stared at the ceiling and thought about my grandfather's watch on the dresser across the room. Do the hours right. I called Preston the next morning and told him I wasn't going to challenge the trust. He was quiet for a moment. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." "Ethan, there are still avenues. I know. I'm not pursuing them." I paused. It's not what she wanted, and honestly, it's not what I want either. Not anymore. Another pause. "All right. I'll put together a formal notice of non-contest." "Thank you, Preston." I could hear him deciding whether to say something else. He settled on, "I think she'd be glad to know that." I said I hoped so. I hung up and sat at my kitchen table and felt something that was not quite peace but was adjacent to it, more like the specific exhaustion that comes after you stop fighting something that was never worth fighting in the first place. I called Charlotte that afternoon. "It's me," I said when she answered. "I'm not contesting the trust." Silence for a beat. "Okay. I want you to know it's not a strategic decision. It's not because my attorney told me the case was unwinnable, although he did tell me that. It's because she was right, the whole thing. Everything in the letter, everything she documented. She was right, and I spent a month trying to find a way around that, and I can't. There isn't one." Charlotte didn't say anything for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful. "Thank you for telling me directly. I also want to say..." I stopped, started again. "I owe you an apology. What I said at the reading, that you'd positioned yourself, that you'd manipulated her. I knew it wasn't true when I said it. I said it because I needed someone to be the villain, and you were standing there." "I know," she said quietly. "That's not an excuse." "No, it's not. But I appreciate you saying it." A pause. "Did you read the letter? The private one?" "Yeah." "Was it..." She seemed to reconsider what she was going to ask. "Are you okay?" And the thing about that question, the thing that caught me off guard, was that it was genuine. Not performative concern, not the careful politeness of someone managing a difficult situation. She actually wanted to know if I was okay. And I realized, sitting there with the phone against my ear, that very few people in my life asked me that question and meant it the way she meant it. "Not really," I said, "but I think that's probably appropriate." "Yeah," she said, "probably." What I didn't know, yet what nobody had told me yet, was that the letter and the trust documents were not the whole of what my mother had prepared. I found out about the rest of it on a Wednesday in December, 6 weeks after the reading, when Douglas Finch called me and asked if I could come to his office. Not Charlotte's attorney calling, not a legal summons. Just Finch, my mother's attorney, asking me to come in because there was a remaining item from the estate he needed to walk me through in person. I drove to his office on a gray December morning with the kind of low-level dread that had become familiar over the past 2 months. Finch's office was in an old building downtown, the kind with dark wood paneling and bookshelves that actually had books on them, and it smelled faintly of coffee and old paper in a way that felt appropriate for the business of final things. He shook my hand. We sat down. "I want to start by saying that what I'm about to show you is not a legal document in the actionable sense," Finch said. "It doesn't change the terms of the trust or the estate distribution, but your mother was very specific that it should be shared with you in person, with context, rather than mailed." He slid a manila folder across the desk. Inside was a stack of pages. Not legal documents, but they were photocopies of handwritten notes, printed emails, and what appeared to be dated journal entries. At the top of the stack was a cover sheet with a single line in my mother's handwriting. "For Ethan. So he understands how I arrived here." "What is this?" I asked. "Your mother kept a personal record over approximately 8 years, Finch said. "Not everything she wrote, but..." She was selective about what she included here, but she organized it specifically with you in mind. She told me she wanted you to understand her reasoning, not just receive the outcome of it. I looked at the stack of pages, maybe 60, 70 sheets. She also asked me to tell you something verbally, which she felt would land differently in person than in writing. He folded his hands on the desk. She said, "Tell him I wasn't keeping score. I was keeping a record. There's a difference, and I hope he's ready to understand it." I picked up the first page. Whammed. I'm not going to reproduce all of it here. Some of it is too private. Some of it is too painful in a way that still doesn't feel like mine to share completely. But I want to tell you what I found in those pages, because it changed the shape of everything I thought I understood about the previous 8 years of my life. My mother had started writing in 2015, the year my father had been dead for 9 years, and the year I had come to her with the first truly significant financial request. A capital infusion for a business venture I'd described as a sure thing. She had given me the money. $340,000. The venture had collapsed within 18 months, and I had told her I'd lost $200,000. The actual loss had been closer to $300,000. She knew. She had known within 4 months of the collapse because she had a quiet relationship with the company's accountant that I hadn't been aware of. She had written in her notes, "He told me it was 200. It was closer to 3. I don't think he lied to protect himself from consequences. I think he lied because he was ashamed and didn't know how to be ashamed in front of me. That concerns me more than the money." I sat in Finch's office and read that and had to set the pages down for a moment. She had known. For 8 years she had known I had understated the loss, and she had never confronted me about it, not once. Not because she'd forgiven it, she wrote about it multiple times across several entries, the question of what it meant about who I was becoming, but because she was watching, waiting to see if I would bring it up myself. I never did. There were entries about the phone calls. She had stopped logging the duration after 2019, she wrote, because the act of recording them was making her sad in a way that wasn't useful. But there were notes about individual conversations, what I'd talked about, what I hadn't. He called today. 40 minutes, which is longer than usual. He spent most of it talking about a deal he's putting together in the Northeast. I asked about his health. He said fine, moving on. I told him I'd been having trouble sleeping. He said he was sorry to hear that and then asked if I'd thought about the Connecticut property as a potential asset to leverage. I didn't say anything about the fact that I have a doctor's appointment Thursday about my hip because I knew it would become a problem-solving exercise rather than a conversation. I put the pages down again, got up, walked to Finch's window and looked out at the street below for a while. "Take your time," Finch said from behind me. "She never told me about the hip until after the surgery," I said. I assumed she just hadn't wanted to worry me." "She wrote about that decision in here," Finch said, "about why she made that choice." I already knew what it would say. I went back to the desk and found the entry. "I've decided not to tell Ethan about the surgery in advance. I know he will come. I know he will do the right things, because he does know how to do the right things when the situation makes the expectation explicit. But I don't want obligation. I have enough of that. I want someone who shows up before they're called. Charlotte called me this morning. She had no idea about the surgery. I hadn't told her either. She just called because she hadn't heard from me in a few days and wanted to check. That is the difference. Not between good people and bad people, between people who wait to be needed and people who pay attention." I read that 3 times. Sitting in that chair in Douglas Finch's office, I read that 3 times, and each time I felt the distance between who I had been and who I should have been like a physical measurement, like something you could put a ruler to. "There's one more thing," Finch said, "near the back." I flipped toward the end of the stack. The last few pages were different from the rest, not journal entries, but what looked like a letter draft, dated 8 months before she died. It was addressed not to me, but to Charlotte. "Charlotte, I want to explain my reasoning to you because you deserve that. I am not giving you the estate because I love you more than I love my son. I don't believe love operates on a hierarchy, and I won't pretend otherwise. I am giving you the estate because you have demonstrated, consistently, and without any knowledge of what was coming, that you understand what it means to care for something beyond yourself. Ethan has not yet learned that. I believe he will. but I cannot wait for that learning to occur before I make this decision, and I will not compromise the work of my lifetime to accommodate someone's potential. What I am hoping, and this is a hope, not an instruction, is that you will find a way to include him. Not in the estate, not in the formal sense, but in the work. If there is any part of him that is ready to show up differently, I hope you will give him the room to do that. Not because he deserves it, because I am asking you to. You have always been more generous than the situations asked you to be. I'm counting on that one more time. I put the pages down. My hands were not entirely steady. She had asked Charlotte to leave a door open, not as a condition, not as an obligation, as a hope. A last request from a woman who had spent the final years of her life watching her son drift and had never stopped believing he could find his way back. She knew, I said, mostly to myself. She knew it was going to be hard, and she set it up anyway. She was very clear-eyed about it, Finch agreed. She told me once, I think it was during the final review of the trust documents, that she wasn't interested in punishing you. She was interested in interrupting the pattern. Her words were, sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to keep absorbing the consequences of their choices. I sat there and let that land. Refuse to keep absorbing the consequences of their choices. She had been absorbing mine for years. The covered losses, the short calls, the surgeon's appointment she'd had alone because she didn't want an obligatory visit, the hip surgery I'd showed up to afterward and said the right things about because that was how I operated, reacting to explicit need, never anticipating it, never paying close enough attention to see it coming. She had stopped absorbing. And in doing so, she had handed me something far more difficult and far more valuable than $40 million. She had handed me the truth about who I was, not as an accusation, as a map. I gathered the pages back into the folder. I looked at Finch across the desk. He was watching me with the expression of a man who has delivered a great many difficult things over a long career and has made his peace with the weight of it. She really thought about all of this, I said. For years, he said. She was a thorough woman. You said that before. It bears repeating. I picked up the folder and held it against my chest for a moment, the way you hold something you're not sure how to carry, but know you can't put down. What do I do now? I asked, and I wasn't asking about the estate, and I think we both knew that. Finch considered the question seriously, which I appreciated. He didn't give me a quick answer. He looked at the window for a moment, then back at me. I think, he said slowly, you start with the thing your mother asked Charlotte to give you room to do. He paused. Show up before you're called. Pay attention. Do the hours right. My grandfather's words. She had told him too, apparently, or maybe he'd arrived at them himself, the way true things have a way of surfacing in multiple places at once when someone needs to hear them. I stood up. I shook his hand. I walked out into the gray December street with my mother's 8 years of careful, heartbroken, hopeful documentation held against my coat. The city moved around me the way it always does. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed the cold air and thought about a woman sitting alone in a house in Westchester, writing down the length of her son's phone calls, and still, writing a letter to the person who was going to inherit everything, asking her to leave the door open. She had not given up on me. Even at the end, even after all of it, the least I could do was stop giving up on myself. I want to tell you that the weeks following Finch's office were marked by some kind of steady, dignified transformation. That I walked out into that December street and began, methodically and with clear intention, to become a different person. That isn't what happened. What happened was January, cold and gray and relentless, the way January in New York always is, and I spent most of it in a state that I can only describe as functional numbness. I went to work, I had meetings, I ate meals I don't remember and slept badly, and woke up at 3 in the morning more times than I can count, lying in the dark with my mother's words running on a loop in my head. I don't want your guilt. Guilt is useless to me now. The problem was that guilt was the thing I had the most of. And she was right. It wasn't doing anything useful. It wasn't moving me forward. It was just weight. The specific kind of weight that doesn't build muscle, it just wears you down. I started seeing a therapist in January. Not because I had some enlightened moment of self-awareness, but because Marcus told me flatly one evening over the phone that I sounded like a man standing at the edge of something and that he'd cover the first month if money was the issue. "It's not money," I said. "Then what's the issue?" I didn't have an answer. I made the appointment the next day. Her name was Dr. Renata Osai, and she had an office on the Upper West Side with a window that looked out onto a fire escape and a radiator that knocked periodically throughout sessions in a way I eventually found reassuring. She was direct in the way that competent therapists are direct, not unkind, but not interested in letting you stay comfortable in your own narrative. In our third session, she said something that I've thought about many times since. She said, "You keep describing your mother's actions as something that was done to you, as a consequence you received, but from everything you've told me, it sounds like what she actually did was refuse to disappear quietly. She refused to let her life and her choices and her carefully considered decisions be treated as background to your story. Does that reframe it at all?" I sat with that for the rest of the session and most of the week after. She was right. I had been so deep inside my own experience of the situation, the loss, the shock, the humiliation of sitting in that dining room and hearing Charlotte's name, that I had been processing it entirely as something that had happened to me. Not as a decision my mother had made about her own life. Not as an act of self-determination by a woman who had spent decades being peripheral to the ambitions of the men around her and had finally, at the end, put herself at the center. That shift, from what was done to me to what she chose for herself, was small in theory and enormous in practice. It changed the texture of the grief. It made the anger harder to sustain, which was uncomfortable because the anger had been the only thing that felt like solid ground. I called Charlotte in February. We had been in occasional contact since December, brief, transactional exchanges mostly. Logistics around the estate transition, a few questions she had about the operational structure of Hawthorne Supply Company that I was better positioned to answer than anyone else. Those conversations had been careful, both of us navigating around the larger things because neither of us was ready to walk directly into them. This call was different. I made it on a Sunday morning, which felt appropriate in a way I couldn't entirely explain. Some echo of the Sunday calls I'd failed to make for years, maybe. A small, private corrective. "I've been thinking about what my mother wrote to you," I said. "In the letter draft. The one in the folder Finch gave me." A pause. "She showed you that?" "It was in the documentation she prepared. She wanted me to read it." "Okay." Charlotte's voice was neutral, waiting. "She asked you to leave a door open. She said she hoped you'd find a way to include me in the work, if I showed up differently." I stopped. "I want to know if that offer is still there, not the estate. I'm not asking about that. I mean the work itself, the company. I know the business better than anyone alive right now. I know the client relationships, the operational history, the supplier contracts. I know where the weaknesses are, and I know what my father built it on. And I'm asking, not demanding, not claiming anything, whether there's a role for that knowledge, under your direction." The silence that followed was long enough that I started to regret calling. "Why?" she asked finally. "What do you actually want out of this?" It was the right question, and she deserved a real answer, not a strategic one. "I want to do something with what she left," I said, "not receive it. Do something with it. And I can't do that on my own because she didn't leave it to me, and that was her decision, and I've made my peace with it. But if the company my grandfather built is going to keep existing in a form that honors what she put into it, I think that's more likely to happen if you and I are working together than if we're working around each other." Another pause. When she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its careful neutrality. "That's the most honest thing you've said to me since this started." "I've been working on honest," I said. I noticed. A beat. "Come up to the house next Saturday. We need to talk through the operational structure anyway, and I've been putting it off because I didn't want to do it with Finch sitting in the middle of it. Bring whatever you have on the supplier contracts." "All right." "Ethan," her voice was quiet, "I'm not doing this because your mother asked me to. I'm doing it because I think she was right about you. I'm not sure yet, but I think she might have been. Don't make me regret it." "I won't," I said, and I meant it with the specific intensity of someone who understands, for the first time, the real weight of a promise. I drove up to Westchester on a Saturday morning in late February. The trees were bare and the sky was the flat white of late winter, and the Hawthorne house looked different to me than it ever had before. Not smaller exactly, but more itself, like I was seeing it without the overlay of assumption that had colored every visit for my entire adult life. Charlotte had set up a workspace in the dining room, the same room where the will reading had taken place, which I noticed and chose not to comment on. There were files spread across the table, a laptop, 2 legal pads. She was dressed casually, coffee in hand, and she looked at me when I walked in with an expression that was neither warm nor cold, assessing. "You look like you've been sleeping badly," she said. "I have." "Same." She gestured at the chair across from her. "Sit down. Let's start with the supplier relationships, because those are the most time-sensitive." We worked for 4 hours. It wasn't comfortable, not at first. There was a stiffness between us that required effort to move through, a constant low-level awareness of everything that had happened and everything that was still unresolved. But the work itself was grounding. It gave us something to focus on that was larger than either of us, and as the morning went on, the stiffness loosened slightly, and by early afternoon we were talking about the business with the directness that the situation required. Charlotte was sharp. I hadn't expected that, which was its own kind of embarrassment. I had known she was a capable person without ever actually engaging with what her capability looked like in practice. She'd been doing her homework. She'd read the financial reports going back 5 years, had a list of pointed questions about a declining margin situation in the Mid-Atlantic contracts, had already been in contact with 2 board members who'd expressed concern about the leadership transition. "You've been talking to Hargrove and Pellman?" I said. "They reached out to Finch first. He referred them to me." She looked at me steadily. "They're nervous." "They're always nervous. Hargrove has been nervous since 2009. It's just his factory setting." But I paused. "What did they say specifically?" "They want stability. They want to know the operational knowledge doesn't walk out the door with the change in ownership." She set down her pen. "I told them I was in conversations with you." "How did they respond to that?" "Better than I expected." She picked up her coffee. "Hargrove said, and I'm quoting, 'If Ethan's willing to stay in the room, that's worth something.'" Something about that landed oddly. Not painfully, differently. Like a recalibration of something I'd stopped believing about myself. "I'll call them," I said, "if that would help." "It would. Awesome." We broke for lunch around 1. Charlotte made sandwiches in the kitchen, efficiently, without ceremony, the way she did everything, and we ate at the kitchen counter instead of the dining room table, which felt like a small, significant shift. Less formal, less arranged. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Sure." "When did she tell you?" "About being sick at the end. Did you know before October?" Charlotte was quiet for a moment, looking at her sandwich. "She told me in August. She'd been having cardiac symptoms for about 6 months, and her cardiologist had given her a realistic picture in the summer. She didn't want aggressive intervention." She paused. "She was very clear about that. She'd made her decisions, and she wanted the time she had left to be on her terms." "Did you argue with her about it?" "Once." The word was flat, with something underneath it. "She listened to everything I said, and then she looked at me and said, 'Charlotte, I've spent my whole life accommodating other people's comfort with my choices. I'm not doing it at the end.' I didn't bring it up again. I stared at the counter. "She told me not to tell you," Charlotte said. "I want you to know that I struggled with that. I thought about calling you anyway, more than once. But it wasn't my decision to make, and she had her reasons." "I know what her reasons were," I said. "She didn't want an obligatory vigil. She wanted to spend August and September the way she wanted to spend them," Charlotte said. "She went to the Shore property for 3 weeks. She read a lot. She went through the house and arranged things. She wrote." A pause. "She seemed, I don't know if peaceful is the right word, but she seemed like herself, more than she had in a while." I thought about the Shore property. I'd been there dozens of times as a child. I tried to picture my mother there alone in September, the water going gray with the shift of seasons, arranging things, writing her careful letters to the people she was leaving behind. Was she scared? I asked, and my voice did something I hadn't planned for it to do. It caught slightly, like a thread pulled too tight. Charlotte looked at me. Yes, she said quietly. Sometimes. She was human, but mostly she seemed like she'd made her peace with it. I nodded, looked at the counter, breathed through it. She talked about you, Charlotte said. At the end. A lot. I looked up. Not in a painful way, she'd say things like, when Ethan was 12, he convinced himself he could fix the sailboat motor, and he actually did it. Took him 3 weeks. Or, Ethan used to call me when he couldn't sleep in college, and we'd talk about nothing for an hour. She was holding on to the real parts. Charlotte's voice was careful. She never stopped seeing them. I had to look away from her for a moment. At the window, at the bare trees in the backyard, at anything except the specific expression on Charlotte's face, which was compassion without pity, and which was harder to sit with than I expected. I called her at night sometimes, I said. In college, I forgot that. She didn't. We went back to work in the afternoon. Around 4, we hit a complication I hadn't anticipated. A contractual issue with one of the major Northeast distributors that had been quietly deteriorating for about 18 months. The kind of thing that doesn't become a crisis until it does. And when I pulled the relevant documents from the file I'd brought, it was immediately clear that it had been worse than the surface numbers showed. This is the Mid-Atlantic margin problem you flagged, I said. How bad? Bad enough. The contract renewal is in April, and if we walk in without a restructured offer, they're going to walk. I spread the documents on the table. I know the account manager there. We've had a relationship for about 6 years. I think I can get us a conversation before the formal renewal process starts, but it needs to happen in the next few weeks. Charlotte studied the numbers. Her jaw tightened slightly. Your mother knew about this? She knew the margins were soft. I don't think she knew how far it had gone. Why not? I didn't answer immediately, because I hadn't told her, was the honest answer. Because the contract had started softening during a period when my attention had been elsewhere, and I'd been managing it quietly without escalating it to the people who needed to know. Charlotte looked at me. She didn't need me to say it out loud. Fix it, she said. Whatever you need from me to support the conversation, I'll provide. But you're taking point on this. I know. And Ethan. She waited until I looked at her. No more quiet management. If something is wrong, I need to know. That's the only way this works. Understood. She held my gaze for a moment, long enough that I knew she was deciding whether to trust what she saw there. I didn't look away. I let her look. Okay, she said finally, and went back to the file. I drove home that evening in the dark, the same route I'd driven after the will reading 4 months earlier, and it felt like a different road even though it was identical. The same miles, the same exits, the same Manhattan skyline assembling itself in the distance as I came off the bridge. Everything the same and everything different. My phone rang around 8. Marcus. How'd it go? Better than I expected, I said. Worse than I hoped. About right, probably. That sounds like progress? Maybe. I merged onto the highway. She's not what I built in my head, Marcus. The version of her I constructed to be angry at. She's just a person. A tired, competent, good person who got handed something enormous that she didn't ask for. Sounds familiar? Marcus said. Don't. I'm just saying, I know what you're saying. I was quiet for a moment. She told me my mother talked about me at the end. The good things, the kid things. Marcus didn't say anything. She never stopped, I said. Even after everything. She never stopped seeing the parts worth keeping. The highway stretched out ahead of me, lit by moving headlights, the city glowing on the horizon. I thought about my grandfather's watch on my dresser. About my mother at the shore in September. About a sticky note in a book that hadn't been meant for me but had found me anyway. You know what the worst part of all of it is? I said. Tell me. I keep finding out that she knew me better than I knew myself. Every single document, every letter, every conversation Charlotte relays, she saw things in me that I didn't see, and I wasted years of that. My hands tightened on the wheel. That's what I can't get past. Not the money, the waste. Marcus was quiet for a few seconds. Then he said, "Ethan, you know what's not wasted?" "What?" "Now." He said it simply, without drama. "Right now, this conversation, that meeting today, the fact that you made the call you made to Preston in December instead of the one you were planning to make in November." A pause. "She bet on you. You can resent her for how she did it, or you can prove her right. But you can't do both at the same time." I sat with that for the rest of the drive. When I got home, I put my grandfather's watch on my wrist. I'd been leaving it on the dresser since October, looking at it, picking it up, putting it back down. It had felt like something I needed to earn the right to wear. I wasn't sure I'd earned it yet, but I put it on anyway, because waiting to feel worthy was the same trap I'd been in before, and I was done waiting for the feeling to arrive before I took the action. Do the hours right. I had a lot of hours left. I intended to do something with them. The Northeast Distributor meeting happened on a Thursday in March, in a conference room in Hartford that smelled like bad coffee and carpet cleaner. I drove up alone. Charlotte had offered to come, and I'd told her I needed to handle this one myself. Not out of ego, or at least I was trying to make sure it wasn't out of ego, but because it was my mess. I had watched this contract deteriorate on my watch during a period when my attention had been everywhere except where it needed to be, and the least I could do was be the one who sat across the table and owned that. The account manager was a man named Roy Castellano, who had been in distribution for 30 years and had exactly zero patience for corporate posturing. We'd worked together since my father's time. He respected the Hawthorne name, but he'd never been impressed by it in the way some people were, which I had always found faintly irritating and now found deeply useful. He shook my hand when I walked in, poured me coffee I didn't ask for, and sat down with the directness of a man who has been waiting for this conversation for a while. "I heard about your mother," he said. "She was a good woman. Real one." "She was." "I also heard about the transition." He looked at me steadily. "New ownership. How does that work for us?" "That's what I'm here to explain." I opened the folder I'd brought. "First, I want to acknowledge that the contract situation has been poorly managed on our end for the better part of 2 years. I know what the numbers look like, and I know you've been patient longer than you should have had to be. That's on me." Roy raised an eyebrow slightly. People in business are not accustomed to that sentence. "Go on." "Charlotte Reed is the new trustee and operational head. She's sharp, she's committed, and she understands what this company is supposed to be. I'm staying on in an advisory and operational capacity. What that means for you is continuity of the relationships and a new structural offer on the contract." I slid the revised proposal across the table. "I want to rebuild this on terms that make sense for both sides. Not a patch job, a real restructure." Roy looked at the proposal. He took his time with it, which was his way. He never reacted in the room. He processed and responded. I drank the bad coffee and waited. "This margin revision," he said finally, "that's a significant concession on your end." "It reflects what the relationship is actually worth to us," I said. "We should have been here 2 years ago." He looked at me for a moment. "You're different than you used to be." I didn't know how to answer that. "I'm working on it." Roy nodded slowly, like that was the right answer. "Let me take this back to my team. I'm not signing today, but I'm not walking either." He stood up, extended his hand. "Tell Ms. Reed she's got a straight dealer in me if she wants one." "I'll tell her." I drove back to the city with the specific exhaustion of someone who has done something correctly for the first time after a long period of doing it wrong. It didn't feel triumphant. It felt like a foundation being poured, unremarkable to look at, essential to everything that comes after. Spring came slowly that year, the way spring does in the Northeast, grudgingly, in fits and starts, warm days collapsing back into cold without warning. By April, the trees around the Westchester house were starting to go green, and Charlotte had begun making real changes to the estate's operational structure that I was watching with a combination of admiration and the occasional clench of old proprietary instinct that I was learning to recognize and set aside. She called me one evening in early April, which was unusual. Our communication had settled into a rhythm of weekly check-ins and specific issue calls, but this felt different from the moment she spoke. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I want to tell you before you hear it from someone else." "Okay." I've been in conversations with a nonprofit organization. They run workforce development programs for low-income young adults in Westchester and the Bronx. I want to establish a partnership with the company. Paid apprenticeships, entry-level pipeline, some funding for the program itself from the trust. She paused. I know that's not how your father ran it. I know it changes some of the financial allocation. I'm not asking for permission. I want to be clear about that. But I'm telling you first because I think you deserve to know before the board does. I sat with that for a moment. The old reaction was right there, available. This is not how we operate. This is mission drift. This is someone who doesn't understand how the business works, trying to turn it into a charity. I felt it. I just didn't say it. What's the organization? I asked instead. She told me. I looked them up while we were on the phone. Their outcomes data was strong. Their leadership had been in the work for over a decade. They weren't a vanity program. Have you talked to Hargrove and Pellman about this? Not yet. You're the first call. Hargrove is going to push back initially, I said. It's his instinct. Give him the outcome data first before the mission framing. He responds to numbers. I paused. And there's a tax structure for corporate partnerships like this that actually improves the balance sheet optics if it's set up right. Preston can walk you through it. Silence for a moment. You're not going to fight me on this, she said. Not quite a question. No. Why not? I thought about it honestly. Because it's a good idea, and because it's the kind of thing my mother would have done if she'd felt like she had the room to do it. I paused. My father built the company. She maintained it. But I don't think maintaining it was ever actually her ambition. I think she had bigger ideas that she kept small because she didn't believe she had the authority to expand them. Another pause. You have the authority. Use it. The silence that followed was different from the careful silences of our early conversations. It was quieter, less defended. Thank you, Charlotte said. And it was simple and direct, and I believed it completely. But the board meeting in May was the first one I attended in a new capacity. Not as heir presumptive, not as a man performing ownership, but as an operational advisor with a defined role and a clearly bounded authority. Charlotte ran the meeting. She was prepared in a way that silenced any residual skepticism in the room within the first 20 minutes, because competence has a way of doing that when it's genuine and unhurried. Hargrove pushed back on the nonprofit partnership, as I'd predicted. Charlotte gave him the outcome data first. He pushed back again, softer. She held her position without aggression, with the specific patience of someone who has made up her mind and is simply waiting for the other person to catch up. At one point, Hargrove looked across the table at me and said, Ethan, you've been quiet. What's your read? And I said, Charlotte's right. The structure works and the organization is solid. I think we move forward. Hargrove looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't fully read, something between surprise and reassessment. Then he said, All right, let's look at the implementation timeline. After the meeting, in the parking lot, Charlotte caught up to me as I was walking to my car. You didn't have to do that, she said. Hargrove respects my read on operational risk. It was useful. I know. I still didn't need you to do it. I know you didn't need me to. I looked at her. I wanted to. There's a difference. She studied my face for a moment. Then she almost smiled. Not quite, but the edges of it. Your mother used to say exactly that, about the difference between need and want. I know, I said. She wrote it in the notes, about Charlotte calling to check in when she hadn't heard in a few days. I paused. I've been thinking about that for months. The distinction between responding to need and just paying attention. Charlotte looked at the ground for a moment. She talked about you like you were worth waiting for, she said quietly. I want you to know that. Not just the 12-year-old fixing boat motors. Right up until the end, she talked about you like you were still capable of becoming what she saw. I didn't trust my voice enough to respond to that immediately. We stood in the parking lot in the May afternoon with the meeting noise fading behind us, and I let it sit there between us without trying to manage it. I'm going to try to be worth it, I said finally. I can't promise I'll always get it right. Nobody gets it right, she said. That was never the point. There's something I did in June that I haven't told many people about, and I want to tell it here because it's part of the story. In a way that the business meetings and the legal resolutions are not. I went to the shore property on a weekend in mid-June, not to assess it, not for any practical reason. I just went. I packed a bag and drove up on a Friday evening and spent the weekend alone in the house where my mother had spent her last September. The house was exactly as she'd left it. Charlotte had aired it out and made sure it was maintained, but nothing had been moved or changed. My mother's reading glasses were still on the side table by the living room window. There was a cardigan on the hook by the back door that she'd worn on cool evenings. A stack of library books on the kitchen counter with a sticky note on top that said, "Return by October 14th" in her handwriting, the date 3 days after she died. I sat in every room. Not morbidly. Or maybe morbidly, I'm not sure there's a clean distinction. I sat in the rooms and I let myself feel what it meant that she had lived here and was gone now, and I didn't try to convert the feeling into anything useful or actionable. I just felt it, the way Dr. Osei had been telling me for months to feel things without immediately reaching for the management lever. On Saturday morning, I sat on the back porch with coffee and watched the water and thought about my grandfather, who I'd never really known, and my father, who I'd known incompletely, and my mother, who I had known less well than I should have and better than I'd realized until she was gone. 3 generations of people who had built things, 2 of them with their hands and their hunger, 1 of them with patience and intelligence and a long, quiet refusal to be diminished, and then me, the 4th, the one who had nearly squandered what they'd left because I'd confused receiving with inheriting. I put on my grandfather's watch that morning and I didn't take it off for the whole weekend. I wore it while I walked the beach. I wore it while I sat on the porch. I wore it on Sunday afternoon when I drove back to the city, the water behind me and the highway ahead, and the summer light stretched long across everything. Do the hours right. He'd engraved it on the back of a watch that had traveled through 3 generations and landed in the hands of the one person who had needed the reminder most. I don't know if there's a word for that kind of precision. Luck seems too small. Design seems too deliberate. It felt like love, the kind that plans ahead. By September, 1 year after my mother's last September at the shore, the Hawthorne Company had stabilized in ways that I would not have predicted 12 months earlier. The Northeast contract had been restructured and signed. The Workforce Development Partnership had launched its first cohort of 12 apprentices, 2 of whom were already being considered for permanent positions. Charlotte had brought in a new operational director, a woman named Sylvia Cho, who had restructured 3 regional distribution networks, and who had, within her first 60 days, identified 3 inefficiencies that had been costing the company quietly for years. The board had stopped being nervous. Hargrove had called me in August, unprompted, to say that he thought the transition had gone better than he'd expected. "Tell Ms. Reed she's got a real instinct for this," he said. And then after a pause, "You're different, Ethan. I don't know what happened, but something happened." "A lot happened," I said. "Well, whatever it was, keep it." I was not a changed man in the way that stories sometimes promise. The complete transformation, the clean break between the before and the after. I still had reflexes I had to watch. I still reached for control in moments of stress. I still had mornings where the grief and the shame and the wasted years hit me somewhere behind the sternum, and I had to sit with it before I could move. Dr. Osei and I still met every other week. It was still work, and it was going to keep being work, and I had made my peace with that. But I was present in a way I hadn't been. That was the most accurate word for it. I was in my own life rather than managing it from a distance. I answered calls from people instead of letting them go to voicemail. I drove up to Westchester not because there was a meeting, but because Charlotte had mentioned offhand that the back garden needed attention, and I knew my mother had planted it herself, and I wanted to see it. Small things. Sustained attention. The practice of showing up before you're called. In October, on the 1-year anniversary of my mother's death, Charlotte and I drove to the cemetery together. Not dramatically. She called in the morning and said she was going in the afternoon and asked if I wanted to come. I said yes. We stood at the grave for a while without talking. It was a cool day, overcast, the trees at the edge of the cemetery already starting to turn. Charlotte had brought flowers, simple ones, not elaborate, which was right. My mother had never cared for elaborate. I had brought the book. The one from the study, the collection of essays with the sticky note still marking the page. I'd been carrying it in my bag for weeks without entirely knowing why. Standing there, I understood why. I'd needed to bring it back, to return it to the proximity of the person it had been meant for, even if that was now only a gesture. I put it at the base of the headstone. Probably someone would remove it eventually. That was fine. Charlotte looked at it. What was the note? Something she wrote to you? I said. About the difference between earning something and expecting it. She said you were right. I paused. I think she'd been having that conversation with you in her head long after you'd had it in person. Charlotte was quiet for a moment. We talked about it once. I told her. I'd said something about how the hardest people to be around are the ones who feel entitled to your time without understanding that time is the only thing you actually give someone. She paused. I didn't know she'd been thinking about it in relation to you. She was, I said. She was thinking about a lot of things in relation to me, quietly, for a long time. The wind moved through the trees at the edge of the cemetery. Somewhere behind us, a car door closed. I used to think she was the quietest person I knew, I said. I've been realizing this year that she wasn't quiet. She was patient. There's a difference. Quiet means you have nothing to say. Patient means you're waiting for the right moment to say it. Charlotte looked at the headstone. She was waiting for you, she said. I know. I paused. I wish I'd shown up before she had to engineer the reason. So do I. Her voice was soft. But you showed up. That still counts. I didn't know if it was enough. I wasn't sure it was supposed to feel like enough. Not the clean, settled enough of absolution, but the ongoing, imperfect enough of a person still trying. The kind of enough you have to earn again every day. My grandfather's watch on my wrist, October light through the turning trees, my mother's name in stone, and a book at the base of it, and a woman beside me who had shown me, without trying to, what it looked like to give someone your actual time instead of the performance of it. I want to talk to you directly, now, at the end of this, because this story isn't really about a will or a trust or $40 million. Those are just the architecture. What the story is actually about, what I've been circling around for this entire year, is something much simpler and much harder. It's about what we do with the people we love when they're still here. I treated my mother's presence like infrastructure, like a road I drove on without thinking about what it took to build it or maintain it. I took the stability of her love and converted it, in my own head, into something I didn't need to tend because it would always be there. And when it wasn't, when the road was gone and I was standing at the edge of it, trying to understand how I'd never noticed how much of my life had been built on top of it, the grief wasn't just for her. It was for every Sunday call I'd kept to 9 minutes, every visit I'd skipped, every moment I had been available and chose not to show up. Here's what I know now that I did not know before. The people who love us most are not permanent. Their patience is not infinite, and the tragedy is not that they leave. The tragedy is that we convince ourselves we have more time than we do, and by the time we understand that we didn't, the chance to use the time differently is already gone. My mother did not give Charlotte the estate to punish me. She did it to interrupt a pattern that would have destroyed me quietly, over years, if nothing had been placed in its path. She did the most difficult and most loving thing a parent can do. She refused to absorb my consequences one more time. She refused to protect me from myself. She let the architecture fall so I could see what had been underneath it. I think about Charlotte, who showed up for years without a scoreboard, who drove up on weekends when she hadn't heard and didn't know there was a reason to worry, who asked questions and listened to the answers and gave her actual time, not the managed version of it. She didn't do it for the inheritance. I know that now in the way I know things that have been proven over time rather than simply stated. And I think about myself, the version of me that sat in that dining room and looked at Charlotte and said the word captured, and what that word revealed about how I'd been seeing the world, that every act of sustained care was secretly a transaction, that nobody did anything without an angle, that love, in its real form, was something I'd never actually examined carefully enough to recognize when I was standing in the middle of it. It took losing almost everything to understand what everything actually was. My mother was a thorough woman. Douglas Finch said that twice, and he meant it as a legal observation, but it was also the truest description of her I've ever heard. She was thorough about love. She documented it. She planned for its continuation past her own death. She arranged things so that the person who had honored it would carry it forward, and she left a door open for the person who hadn't, because she believed, thoroughly, carefully, with the same precision she brought to everything, that he still could. I am still trying to be worth that belief. Some days I am closer to it than others. That is not a failure condition. That is just the work. If there is a single thing I want you to take from this story, not a lesson exactly, but a question worth sitting with, it's this. Who in your life is keeping track of your Sunday calls? Who is logging the length of conversations you have no idea are being measured? Not because they're trying to document your failures, but because your presence matters so much to them that its absence has to be accounted for somewhere. And what would it cost you to make those calls longer? To show up before you're called? To give someone your actual time instead of the managed, efficient 9-minute version of it? The Hawthorne name still exists. The company still runs. The apprenticeship program is in its second cohort. Charlotte is building something real out of what my mother left, and I am part of that building in the only way that was ever going to mean anything. Not as owner, not as heir, but as someone who finally learned to show up and do the work. And on my wrist, every day, a worn watch with scratched crystal and a message on the back that has traveled through 4 generations and is still true. Do the hours right? I'm working on it. That's the best I can tell you. I'm working on it. It took losing almost everything to understand what everything actually was. My mother was a thorough woman. Douglas Finch said that twice, and he meant it as a legal observation, but it was also the truest description of her I've ever heard. She was thorough about love. She documented it. She planned for its continuation past her own death. She arranged things so that the person who had honored it would carry it forward, and she left a door open for the person who hadn't, because she believed, thoroughly, carefully, with the same precision she brought to everything, that he still could. I am still trying to be worth that belief. Some days I am closer to it than others. That is not a failure condition. That is just the work. If there is a single thing I want you to take from this story, not a lesson exactly, but a question worth sitting with, it's this. Who in your life is keeping track of your Sunday calls? Who is logging the length of conversations you have no idea are being measured, not because they're trying to document your failures, but because your presence matters so much to them that its absence has to be accounted for somewhere? And what would it cost you to make those calls longer? To show up before you're called? To give someone your actual time instead of the managed, efficient 9-minute version of it? The Hawthorne name still exists. The company still runs. The apprenticeship program is in its second cohort. Charlotte is building something real out of what my mother left, and I am part of that building in the only way that was ever going to mean anything. Not as owner, not as heir, but as someone who finally learned to show up and do the work. And on my wrist, every day, a worn watch with scratched crystal and a message on the back that has traveled through 4 generations and is still true. Do the hours right. I'm working on it. That's the best I can tell you. I'm working on it.